Berlin, a city at the dawn of a new century, 1900 and beyond. In 1900, Berlin stood at the crossroads of rapid transformation. Once the formal seat of Prussian kings and royal administrators, it had, over the course of the 19th century, evolved into the political, economic, and intellectual heart of the German Empire. Founded in 1871, what had begun as a courtly capital now pulsed with factories, traffic, commerce, and ambition. By the turn of the century, Berlin was no longer a modest court city. It had become one of Europe's largest and most dynamic urban centers, with a population approaching 2 million residents and growing by the day. Thousands of new arrivals poured in from the countryside and smaller towns, drawn by the promise of work, education, and opportunity. The city expanded outward in every direction, absorbing suburban villages and reshaping them into bustling districts. Daily life in Berlin moved to the rhythm of modern industry. Factory whistles echoed across the skyline at dawn and dusk, signaling shifts in the city's vast network of metalworks, textile mills, chemical plants, and electrical workshops. Tram bells rang through busy streets, while horse-drawn carts and early motor cars competed for space along broad boulevards and narrow side lanes. The newly developed elevated and underground railways knit neighborhoods together, connecting residential quarters with industrial districts and administrative centers. Rows of tall brick chimneys rose above the working-class neighborhoods of Mobit, Wedding, and Friedrichshain, where crowded tenement blocks, Mietskasernen, or rental barracks, housed the city's rapidly expanding labor force. Life there was often cramped and noisy, but also full of community, cafe conversations, and neighborhood associations. Street markets filled courtyards and squares, offering vegetables, bread, and smoked fish to families who lived many stories above the ground. Meanwhile, in the city center, monumental buildings proclaimed Berlin's national importance. Along Unter den Linden and its surrounding streets stood museums, libraries, universities, and imperial ministries. Scholars, scientists, and civil servants walked the same avenues as diplomats and military officers. The Berlin University, alongside institutes such as the Physikalische Technische Reichsanstalt and the Charite Hospital, made the city a global hub of research and scientific innovation. Laboratories and lecture halls buzzed with experiments in physics, chemistry, medicine, and engineering, anticipating the technological revolutions that would define the 20th century. Culturally, Berlin thrived as well. Its theaters, music halls, and cabarets drew audiences from every social class. Opera houses staged grand performances, while new cafes became meeting places for writers, artists, and political thinkers. Newspapers and illustrated magazines circulated widely, shaping public debate and reflecting the city's growing sense of modern identity. Yet Berlin was also a place of contrasts. Wealthy neighborhoods in Charlottenburg and Tiergarten displayed ornate townhouses, elegant parks, and refined social life, while industrial quarters faced overcrowding, noise, and pollution. Debates over labor rights, housing conditions, and social reform grew increasingly urgent as politicians, workers' groups, and municipal leaders struggled to adapt the city to its enormous scale and pace of change. In many ways, Berlin at the dawn of the 20th century embodied the spirit of modern Europe: energetic, ambitious, confident, and restlessly forward-looking. It was a city of industry and administration, of science and culture, of opportunity and inequality, all unfolding side by side. Standing at the threshold of a new century, Berlin was not only the capital of an empire, it was a living laboratory of urban modernity, a place where technology, society, and everyday life were being reshaped in ways that would echo far beyond its streets and skyline. The growing heart of an empire by 1900, Berlin functioned not only as the imperial capital of the German Empire, but also as one of its most important industrial and administrative hubs. The city drew workers, clerks, engineers, and craftsmen from across Germany and from regions of Eastern Europe, all seeking employment in factories, workshops, construction sites, and public offices. This steady migration fueled population growth in districts such as Mobit, Kreuzberg, Wedding, and Friedrichshain, where dense tenement, housing, and new industrial complexes reshaped the urban landscape. At the same time, Berlin's metropolitan area extended beyond its official borders. Some communities often associated with Berlin, including Charlottenburg, Schönberg, and Wilmersdorf, were still legally independent municipalities at the turn of the century. Though separate in administration, they were closely tied to Berlin through labor markets, trade, transportation routes, and social life. These neighboring towns would not be formally incorporated into the city until the 1920 Greater Berlin Act, but even before that reform, they functioned as integral parts of the broader urban region. Urban infrastructure modernized rapidly as the city adapted to its expanding population and economic activity. Horse-drawn trams, once the backbone of local transport, were increasingly replaced by faster and more efficient electric trams. In 1902, Berlin opened its first underground railway line, the U-Bahn, marking a major step toward a modern mass transit system. Suburban rail networks connected outlying residential districts with central administrative and commercial zones, allowing workers and students to travel greater distances than ever before. Railway stations, depots, and bridges became defining features of the city's architecture and daily rhythm. Industrial growth shaped both Berlin's skyline and its identity. Factories produced machinery, precision tools, railway equipment, and electrical components. The influence of large firms such as Siemens and AEG was especially significant. They built vast production facilities, research labs, and worker housing complexes, helping turn Berlin into a leading European center of engineering and industrial manufacturing, electrical technology, and innovation. Scientific research and medical advancement publishing, newspapers, and the arts universities, scientific institutes, and hospitals strengthened the city's reputation as an intellectual capital. The Charite and other medical institutions attracted researchers from across Europe, while technical colleges supported innovation in chemistry, physics, and engineering. Berlin's publishing houses, newspaper offices, and printing presses contributed to a vibrant public sphere, producing political commentary, literature, and mass circulation journalism. Cafes, lecture halls, reading clubs, and artistic salons emerged as gathering places for scholars, students, writers, artists, and political thinkers. Conversations in these spaces reflected the changing spirit of the age. Debates on social reform, industrialization, urban society, and Germany's role in world affairs. Cultural life thrived in theaters, concert halls, and museums, reinforcing Berlin's role as both an imperial capital and a modern cultural metropolis. Beneath its confidence and outward progress, however, Berlin remained a city marked by sharp social contrasts. Wealthier residents in more affluent districts enjoyed spacious homes, parks, and cultural privileges, while many working-class families lived in crowded courtyards and narrow apartments, often facing long workdays and limited social protections. These inequalities shaped local politics and public debate as municipal leaders, reformers, and labor organizations sought ways to address housing, sanitation, wages, and urban living conditions. In this combination of ambition and disparity, innovation and struggle, Berlin at the dawn of the 20th century embodied the complexities of a rapidly modernizing empire, a city growing in power, influence, and confidence, yet still negotiating the challenges of industrial urban life. The early 20th century, growth and inequality. As the new century advanced, Berlin continued to expand both physically and socially, reflecting the momentum of industrialization and urban modernization. New housing developments rose along the outskirts of the city, gradually transforming villages and open fields into dense residential districts. Railway stations, suburban lines, and electric tram routes strengthened these outer neighborhoods' connection to the city center, supporting a growing commuter workforce that moved daily between factories, offices, and workshops. Universities, academies, and research institutes attracted students and scholars from across Germany and from other parts of Europe. Berlin's laboratories and lecture halls became hubs of scientific discovery and innovation, particularly in fields such as physics, chemistry, medicine, and engineering. Intellectual life thrived in libraries, academic societies, and public lecture venues, reinforcing the city's reputation as one of Europe's leading centers of research and scholarship. Yet this rapid urban growth also exposed and deepened clear social inequalities. Housing conditions varied dramatically across districts and social groups. Middle-class families and elite households occupied spacious apartments along wide boulevards and in newer, affluent neighborhoods, where buildings featured decorative facades, high ceilings, and tree-lined streets. These areas offered better access to parks, cultural venues, and urban amenities. In contrast, many industrial workers and their families lived in densely built Mietskasernen, the so-called rental barracks that characterized much of Berlin as working-class housing. These large courtyard blocks often stretched deep into the interior of city lots, with multiple wings and layers of apartments arranged around narrow courtyards. Several families frequently shared a single floor or staircase, and cramped flats with limited light and ventilation were common. In the poorer sections of these buildings, overcrowding and sanitation problems posed serious public health concerns. Conditions in these neighborhoods sparked growing attention from reformers, social investigators, and municipal planners. Journalists, doctors, and social organizations documented everyday living circumstances in working-class districts, highlighting issues such as housing density, nutrition, child labor, and workplace safety. Their reports fueled public debate and encouraged city officials to consider new approaches to urban management. In response, local authorities and reform-minded politicians promoted efforts to improve public health, expand access to clean water and sanitation, introduce stricter building regulations, and establish green spaces and recreational areas. Discussions about labor conditions, wages, and workers' rights increasingly shaped political life, especially as trade unions and social democratic movements gained influence. Berlin in the early 20th century was therefore more than a growing metropolis. It was a focal point for broader debates about social change, urban life, and the consequences of industrial modernity. The city embodied both the optimism of technological and intellectual progress and the tensions created by inequality, crowding, and economic disparity. In this complex environment, questions about housing, society, and the future of urban development stood at the center of public conversation, helping define the city's path into the decades ahead. On the edge of uncertainty, 1910 to 1914, by the early 1910s, Berlin ranked among the world's largest and most influential cities, both in population and political importance. Its commercial streets, department stores, and modern shopping arcades transformed patterns of urban consumption. Grand retail centers along major boulevards attracted customers from across the metropolis, offering mass-produced goods, fashion, and household items that reflected new forms of middle-class life. Automobiles, still relatively rare but increasingly visible, began to appear alongside horse-drawn carts, trams, and bicycles, symbolizing the gradual shift toward a new technological era in transportation. Cultural and artistic experimentation reached new heights during these years. Theaters, concert halls, galleries, and studios fostered environments where avant-garde playwrights, musicians, and visual artists explored themes of modern society, urbanization, and psychological experience. Berlin's creative circles interacted with broader European artistic movements, contributing to a vibrant and sometimes controversial cultural climate. At the same time, political tensions within the city intensified. Rapid industrialization and social inequality fueled the growth of workers' organizations and trade unions, which demanded labor reforms, improved wages, and better housing conditions. Mass meetings, public speeches, and organized demonstrations became regular features of urban life. In response, conservative and nationalist forces, including segments of the political elite and parts of the middle class, resisted such changes, emphasizing order, imperial authority, and national unity. These competing visions for Germany's future often played out directly in Berlin's streets, newspapers, and parliamentary debates. The city became a stage for ideological confrontation, where questions about democracy, social policy, and the direction of the empire were argued openly. When the First World War began in 1914, the atmosphere of restless debate gave way to an abrupt transformation of daily life. Berlin remained an administrative and industrial command center, responsible for coordination, supply, and communication across the empire. Factories shifted production toward military needs, and civic institutions reorganized around wartime demands. Yet the conflict soon brought shortages, rationing, and growing hardship to ordinary residents. Families faced uncertainty as loved ones were mobilized, while economic strain and limited resources reshaped daily routines. In this period on the eve of war, Berlin embodied both the confidence of a modern imperial capital and the fragility of a society entering an era of profound upheaval, a city poised between innovation, tension, and the uncertainties that would define the years to come. A capital of ideas and innovation, 1905 to 1910. Between 1905 and 1910, Berlin emerged as one of Europe's foremost centers of intellectual and cultural activity, gaining recognition not only for its industrial strength, but also for its role in shaping modern thought. The city became a magnet for scholars, researchers, and creative figures, standing at the intersection of academic research and higher education medicine and clinical science philosophy, economics, and social theory, avant-garde art, theater, and music universities and scientific institutes formed the backbone of this intellectual world. Laboratories, lecture halls, and hospitals fostered advances in chemistry, physics, and medical practice, drawing students and specialists from across Europe and beyond. Clinical research institutions, including major hospitals and medical faculties, contributed to new approaches in surgery, diagnostics, and public health, helping establish Berlin as a leading center of modern medical science. The city's publishing houses, newspapers, and editorial offices played an equally important role in shaping national discourse. Daily papers, political journals, and literary magazines circulated throughout the empire, distributing commentary on government policy, urban life, culture, and international affairs. Public debates unfolded in cafes, lecture rooms, and academic societies, where writers, academics, and reformers discussed questions of social inequality, labor, education, and the responsibilities of a modern industrial state. Meanwhile, the population continued to expand, extending the city's residential footprint into areas such as Schönberg, Neukölln, and Mobit. Though some communities, notably Charlottenburg and Schönberg, remained legally independent municipalities during this period, they were increasingly integrated into Berlin's economic and transportation networks. Tram routes, suburban rail lines, and shared markets linked these towns to the capital's workplaces, cultural institutions, and administrative centers, creating a broader metropolitan region that functioned as a single urban organism in practice, if not yet in law. Cultural experimentation flourished alongside intellectual life. New artistic movements challenged traditional forms in painting, theater, and music, while concert halls and cabaret stages attracted diverse audiences. Berlin's artistic circles explored themes of modernity, urban experience, and social change, mirroring the transformations unfolding across the city. Yet beneath this outward image of progress and innovation, stark differences in living standards persisted. While educated professionals and prosperous middle-class residents enjoyed comfortable apartments, cultural opportunities, and access to education, many industrial workers still faced crowded housing, long working hours, and limited economic security. These contrasts reinforced ongoing calls for reform in housing, welfare policy, and municipal governance. In this period, Berlin stood as both a beacon of intellectual confidence and a city deeply engaged in debates about its social future. A modern capital whose achievements in science and culture existed alongside the pressing challenges of urban inequality. On the edge of uncertainty, 1910 to 1914, by the early 1910s, Berlin ranked among the world's largest and most influential cities, both in population and political importance. Its commercial streets, department stores, and modern shopping arcades transformed patterns of urban consumption. Grand retail centers along major boulevards attracted customers from across the metropolis, offering mass-produced goods, fashion, and household items that reflected new forms of middle-class life. Automobiles, still relatively rare but increasingly visible, began to appear alongside horse-drawn carts, trams, and bicycles, symbolizing the gradual shift toward a new technological era in transportation. Cultural and artistic experimentation reached new heights during these years. Theaters, concert halls, galleries, and studios fostered environments where avant-garde playwrights, musicians, and visual artists explored themes of modern society, urbanization, and psychological experience. Berlin's creative circles interacted with broader European artistic movements, contributing to a vibrant and sometimes controversial cultural climate. At the same time, political tensions within the city intensified. Rapid industrialization and social inequality fueled the growth of workers' organizations and trade unions, which demanded labor reforms, improved wages, and better housing conditions. Mass meetings, public speeches, and organized demonstrations became regular features of urban life. In response, conservative and nationalist forces, including segments of the political elite and parts of the middle class, resisted such changes, emphasizing order, imperial authority, and national unity. These competing visions for Germany's future often played out directly in Berlin's streets, newspapers, and parliamentary debates. The city became a stage for ideological confrontation, where questions about democracy, social policy, and the direction of the empire were argued openly. When the First World War began in 1914, the atmosphere of restless debate gave way to an abrupt transformation of daily life. Berlin remained an administrative and industrial command center, responsible for coordination, supply, and communication across the empire. Factories shifted production toward military needs, and civic institutions reorganized around wartime demands. Yet the conflict soon brought shortages, rationing, and growing hardship to ordinary residents. Families faced uncertainty as loved ones were mobilized, while economic strain and limited resources reshaped daily routines. In this period on the eve of war, Berlin embodied both the confidence of a modern imperial capital and the fragility of a society entering an era of profound upheaval, a city poised between innovation, tension, and the uncertainties that would define the years to come. War, crisis, and social change. 1914 to 1923. During the First World War and in the turbulent years that followed, Berlin experienced profound economic, social, and political upheaval. Wartime mobilization placed enormous pressure on the city's industrial and administrative systems. Factories shifted to support military production, while workers faced long hours and limited resources. Food shortages became widespread, with rationing affecting daily life across neighborhoods. Prices for essential goods soared, and ordinary Berliners, particularly working-class families, struggled to maintain basic standards of living. The war's end in 1918 brought both relief and instability. Berlin became the political heart of the new Weimar Republic, but the transition from empire to republic was far from smooth. Political uprisings erupted in the winter of 1918 to 1919 as revolutionary councils clashed with conservative and military forces, leaving streets marked by protest, barricades, and sporadic violence. The city became a focal point of ideological conflict as socialists, communists, and nationalist factions vied for influence. Public demonstrations, strikes, and political debates were common, and Berliners found themselves navigating an environment of uncertainty alongside hopes for reform. Economic crises compounded these challenges. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s devastated savings and destabilized households, particularly among the middle and working classes. Families struggled to purchase food and basic necessities, while municipal authorities attempted to maintain public services and infrastructure under enormous financial strain. The city's population, already diverse and dynamic, became a mosaic of hardship, resilience, and adaptive ingenuity. Yet amid these difficulties, Berlin also emerged as a remarkable hub of cultural and social innovation. The pressures of crisis seemed to spur creativity, experimentation, and new ways of thinking about urban life. Architects and planners pioneered modernist approaches to housing and city design, aiming to improve living conditions in the wake of overcrowding and poor sanitation. Film studios, theaters, and cabarets explored bold narratives and experimental techniques, making Berlin a global center for cinema and performance art. Visual artists, writers, and journalists engaged with the city's social realities, producing works that critiqued inequality, celebrated urban life, or imagined new cultural possibilities. By the early 1920s, Berlin had become a city of contrasts, a place where hardship and uncertainty coexisted with artistic innovation and social experimentation. Factory districts, tenement courtyards, and bustling marketplaces sat alongside avant-garde theaters, art studios, and modernist housing projects. Streets that had witnessed protest and political unrest now also hosted exhibitions, concerts, and literary gatherings. In this period, Berlin's identity was both contested and creative. The city reflected the struggles of a society emerging from war and revolution, yet it also demonstrated the capacity of urban culture to adapt, innovate, and inspire. In every district, from industrial neighborhoods to newly developed residential zones, Berlin embodied the intertwined forces of crisis and creativity that would shape its character for decades to come. The Greater Berlin Act and the Changing City, 1920. One of the most significant turning points in Berlin's history came in 1920 with the passage of the Greater Berlin Act, Großberlin-Gesetz, a sweeping law that fundamentally transformed the city's political, geographic, and social landscape. Before the act, Berlin had consisted of the central city and a patchwork of independent towns and villages that, while economically and socially connected to the capital, retained their own administrations. The act unified these areas, creating a single metropolitan entity that would define Berlin as it is known today. Under the provisions of the Greater Berlin Act, dozens of surrounding towns and suburbs were incorporated into the city. Among the most notable were Charlottenburg, Schönberg, Neukölln, Köpenick, Wilmersdorf, and Lichtenberg. Each of these formerly independent municipalities brought its own unique character, architecture, and population to the new city, enriching Berlin's social and cultural fabric. Previously separate civic administrations, local markets, and public institutions were integrated into a larger municipal system, creating new opportunities and challenges for governance, urban planning, and public services. As a result of this territorial expansion, Berlin's population jumped dramatically, reaching nearly 4 million residents. In both population and area, Berlin became one of the largest cities in Europe, surpassing many older capitals in scale and complexity. The city now spanned over 883 square kilometers, combining dense urban neighborhoods, industrial districts, sprawling parks, and emerging residential suburbs. The Greater Berlin Act also marked the beginning of what historians often call modern metropolitan Berlin. The newly unified city required coordinated infrastructure planning, including transport networks, utilities, and housing development. Tram lines and suburban railways were extended to reach newly incorporated districts, while street layouts, sewage systems, and public facilities were gradually standardized. Municipal authorities faced the challenge of integrating diverse populations, each with distinct social traditions, economic conditions, and local identities, into a single urban polity. Beyond administrative changes, the act symbolized a shift in Berlin's identity. The city was no longer just a political and industrial capital. It was a metropolis with the scale, diversity, and ambition of a global urban center. Social life, commerce, culture, and politics now operated on a citywide level, reflecting the complex interplay of old neighborhoods and newly incorporated communities. The Greater Berlin Act of 1920 thus set the stage for the modern city we recognize today, a sprawling, vibrant, and dynamic metropolis where industrial power, cultural innovation, and social diversity converged on an unprecedented scale. It was a moment when Berlin's urban growth, social complexity, and political significance coalesced, creating the foundation for the city's role as a leading European capital throughout the 20th century.
The Golden October 20 tahun 1924 knock after the devastating hyperinflation of the early tahun 1920 was brought under control in tahun 1924. With the introduction of the Rentenware, Berlin entered a period of an outgrowing modernization and cultural prominence. The city's economy stabilized. Public confidence slowly returned, and ambitious urban development projects reshaped its neighborhoods. Modern apartment blocks rose along with the next streets, while new schools, libraries, and community centers improved public services. Green spaces and parks were recreated or expanded, reflecting the influence of city planners committed to bettering urban life for all residents. Public transportation networks, including trams, buses, and suburban rail lines, were extended and upgraded, connecting the ever-growing metropolitan area more efficiently and supporting the mobility of workers, students, and visitors alike culturally. Berlin became a beacon of modernity and international attention. Film studios in the city produced silent cinema masterpieces that attracted global audiences, while theaters, cabarets, and concert halls thrived, experimenting with avant-garde performance, satire, and musical innovation. Berlin's cafes, salons, and publishing houses were hubs for journalists, curators, and intellectuals, fostering lively discussion on politics, society, and the arts. Architecture and design flourished, from the functional elegance of municipal housing projects to bold modernist innovations that challenge traditional forms. Scientific institutes and universities continued to attract leading thinkers, reinforcing Berlin's reputation as a center of research. The intellectual debate and technological progress. Yet this period of golden 20s optimism existed alongside underlying social and political tension. While middle class and wealthy citizens enjoyed the prosperity and cultural vibrancy of the city, many working class and low-income families still faced economic uncertainty, inadequate housing, and limited access to public services. Social reformers continued to advocate for improvement, highlighting inequalities that remained unchanged despite the city's outward dynamism. Toward the end of the decade, the international economy began to strain under the wake of global debt, trade fluctuations. When the effects of the tahun 1929 Wall Street crash, economic pressures returned to Berlin, triggering unemployment, social unrest, and political polarization. Radical political movements gained traction among disaffected workers and citizens, while conservative and nationalist forces resisted change. The GTS streets, once dominated by the energy of cultural experimentation, increasingly witnessed the rumblings of conflict, protest, and debate. In this way, Berlin during the tahun 1920 embodied both brilliance and fragility, a city of extraordinary creativity, modernist ambition, and international renown, yet on increasing fragmentation and turbulence existed city, shaping the modern metropolis in both its achievements and its anxieties.
Berlin by 1930. A city transformed between 1900 and 1930, Berlin underwent a transformation more dramatic and far-reaching than at any earlier moment in its history. In just 3 decades, the city evolved from a compact imperial capital into one of the world's largest and most complex metropolitan centers, a place shaped by industry, migration, political revolution, cultural innovation, and the tensions of modern urban life. The Berlin of 1900 was still deeply rooted in the structures of the German Empire. It was the seat of Prussian administration and imperial authority, defined by ministries, military offices, and an expanding network of factories and railway lines. Its neighborhoods were dense and closely packed, filled with stone apartment blocks, workshops, and small courtyards where workers and families lived side by side. Smoke rose from industrial chimneys, trams rattled through crowded streets, and markets, cafes, and beer halls formed the social rhythm of daily life. Though already one of Europe's major cities, Berlin was still largely concentrated within a relatively limited urban area. Over the next 30 years, that older city would be reshaped in almost every respect. Growth, migration, and the expanding city industrialization accelerated rapidly in the early 20th century. Factories multiplied across Berlin and its surrounding districts, drawing workers, technicians, and clerks from across Germany and from regions beyond its borders. Rural migrants arrived seeking jobs, opportunity, and the promise of modern urban life. Many settled in densely built working-class neighborhoods, where families often shared small apartments and courtyards served as community spaces for play, conversation, and household work. As new suburbs developed beyond the traditional city limits, railways and tram lines connected residential districts with industrial zones and city centers. The city's physical footprint expanded steadily, but it was the Greater Berlin Act of 1920 that marked the decisive turning point. This legislation united dozens of outlying towns, villages, and suburbs into a single municipal entity, multiplying Berlin's size and creating the foundation of the vast metropolitan region recognizable today. The new Greater Berlin was enormous in scale. Its territory became one of the largest urban areas in Europe. Its population approached 4 million people. Administrative responsibilities expanded dramatically. With this expansion came both opportunity and challenge. Local governments now had to coordinate housing policy, transportation planning, sanitation, public health, and education across areas that had previously operated independently. Politics, upheaval, and the birth of a new state, the First World War, reshaped Berlin in ways no one could have anticipated in 1900. During the war years, the city became a center of administration and military coordination. Factories shifted to wartime production, and resources grew scarce. Rationing, shortages, and social strain affected daily life for families across the city. At the same time, political tensions simmered beneath the surface, tensions that would erupt with the end of the war in 1918. The collapse of the German Empire and the revolutionary movements that followed turned Berlin into the central stage of political change. Demonstrations, strikes, and calls for reform swept through the streets as the old monarchy gave way to the democratic framework of the Weimar Republic. New political parties, civic institutions, and parliamentary processes emerged, accompanied by intense debate over the direction of German society. Berlin became not only the nation's administrative capital, but also a symbol of its uncertainty, experimentation, and fragile hopes for democratic governance. The city's newspapers, meeting halls, and universities became arenas for political thought and public argument, reflecting both the energy and instability of the era. Innovation, industry, and urban modernization despite recurring crises. The 1920s were also years of astonishing progress. Berlin developed into a major industrial and technological hub. Electrical engineering firms and research laboratories advanced new technologies, universities, and scientific institutes fostered innovation. Transportation networks modernized, including underground rail expansion. Urban planners and architects confronted the social challenges of overcrowded housing. Reformers promoted new approaches to public health, sanitation, and urban design. Large-scale housing projects introduced modernist architecture, wider courtyards, improved ventilation, and green spaces intended to promote better living conditions for working-class families. Municipal reformers worked to expand access to public schools, libraries, hospitals and health clinics, parks and recreation facilities. The city's government increasingly saw social welfare and urban planning as central responsibilities, an idea that would significantly influence later European urban policy. Culture, creativity, and the making of a global metropolis. By the mid-1920s, Berlin had gained a reputation as one of the world's great cultural capitals. Theaters, cabarets, concert halls, and opera houses flourished across the city. Cinemas multiplied rapidly, helping turn Berlin into a center for the emerging film industry. Publishers, journals, and newspapers made the city a hub for writers, journalists, and intellectuals from across Europe. Artists and thinkers were drawn to the city's atmosphere of experimentation, debate, and creative energy. Modernist art, new architectural movements, and bold literary styles found space to develop in an environment where tradition and innovation collided daily. Cafes and salons became gathering places for conversation, spaces where ideas about politics, philosophy, science, and culture intersected. Berlin's cultural life projected far beyond Germany's borders. Observers from other countries described the city as dynamic, restless, and modern, a place where the pace of change seemed relentless. Contrasts, inequality, and urban struggle, yet for all its progress, Berlin was also a city of deep contrasts. Prosperous neighborhoods existed alongside overcrowded working-class districts. Some residents benefited from new employment opportunities and social reform, while others struggled with unemployment, rising prices, and unstable economic conditions. Periodic crises and political unrest created uncertainty for families and communities. Social activists, city officials, and reform organizations worked to address housing shortages, child welfare, and education, public hygiene, and health conditions. Workers' rights and social protections. These efforts represented both the promise and the limits of urban reform. Even as new housing projects and welfare programs emerged, inequality and social pressure remained defining features of city life. A city of possibility. By 1930, Berlin stood as a metropolis unlike any other in its history. It was vast in scale, diverse in population, politically central, culturally influential, economically complex. Factories and laboratories existed beside theaters and cafes. Modernist housing estates rose on the city's edges, while dense historic neighborhoods continued to shape daily life in its core. Trams, railways, and underground lines connected a city that now stretched across fields and former villages. Berlin had become a place of ambition and contradiction, a city where innovation met struggle, where reform confronted inequality, and where the future of modern urban society seemed to be tested every day. The Berlin that entered the 20th century had laid its foundations in administration, industry, and urban growth. The Berlin of 1930 had built upon those foundations to become a global metropolis, energetic, resilient, complex, and vividly alive, standing at the center of a rapidly changing world.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share.